I'm going to give you a quick background to give a scope of what we're going to be talking about today. Mickey Kendall started the hashtag Solidarities for White Women as a response to digital feminism's response to Hugo Schweizer. Any of you have heard of him. He built his own feminist platform by silencing women of color while supporting white feminists. Kendall felt that majority of the digital feminist world was dismissing women of color in favor of a brand of solidarity that centers on the safety and comfort of white women. What started as a moment of frustration led to one of the most contested hashtags in the feminist world, and leads us here today to our own take on that discussion. And I'm going to turn it over to Anna Maria. She's going to help us introduce our panelists.
Great, so we're going to introduce our panelists one by one. So Laurie Adelman, who is down all over at the left, is the executive director of Feministing.com, where she oversees partnerships and outreach. She has been with Feministing since 2009 and covers a range of topics, including reproductive justice, gender, global health, and media. Laurie also works in the global division of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, providing communications and advocacy support to partners in Latin America and Africa. She also holds a BA from Harvard College.
And over to her right, we have Olivia Canlas. She's from Affirm, and Affirm, she's New York City chapter coordinator. Olivia Canlas is the chapter coordinator for the New York City chapter of Affirm. Affirm, otherwise known as the Association of Filipinas, Feminists Fighting Imperialism, Refeudalization, and Marginalization, is a national organization of women engaged in transnationalist, feminist, anti-imperialist activism. They are committed to militant movement building from the U.S. and effecting change through grassroots organizing, trans-ethnic alliance building, education, advocacy, and direct action. And over to her right, we have Tiloma Jayasinghe. She's the executive director of Sakhi from South Asian Women. Tiloma is the executive director, as I said, and she's been the executive director since February 2010. She was formerly a social affairs officer at the United Nations Division for the Advancement of Women, where she was responsible for analyzing and identifying policies and practices eliminating violence against women from an international perspective. She's a graduate of New York University and the George Washington University School of Law.
And Patricia Valoy, she is a blogger at Womanisms and Everyday Feminism. She is a trained civil engineer and an outspoken supporter for girls considering careers in the fields of STEM. She also speaks and writes on a variety of issues affecting the Latina community, including racism, safe abortion access, and domestic violence. Patricia is a graduate of Columbia University. We're still waiting on Nicole Moore to show up, but we are going to get started, and she can chime in as the discussion goes on, okay?
Right, so we're going to open up the first question to everybody in the room, to our panelists. What is solidarity is for white women mean to you, and how have you been involved in this particular movement? And if anyone wants to start off, please do. Sure.
When the hashtag Solidarity is for White Women popped up in my Twitter feed, which I'm really active in, I didn't really know how to respond to it. I was like, what does it mean? I always felt a little bit like in between. I'm like, I'm kind of light skinned. I'm Latina. Where do I belong? Am I part of this white women block, or do I belong to black women? Where do I belong in this space? So I let it go for some time, and I sort of listened. And as other women of color were approaching situations and saying, how they felt silenced, how they felt, betrayed, how they felt that their issues were not ever brought to the forefront, I was like, this is me. And it was very organically, just popped up. I said, you know what, I felt this way a lot, that I was conforming myself to what I thought feminism was, or American feminism, or white feminism, however we want to call it. From reading feminist blogs online, I'm like, I should care about slut walk. I should care about this issue. And then when I really thought about that in my life, it didn't connect. I would never call myself a slut. I would never go to slut walk. How can we, as women of color, call ourselves sluts when it's used to objectify us? When we're sold into sex slavery? And how can I rebrand that and say, like, I'm going to own that name? And that's how I started to say, you know what, I really have to start thinking about what does it mean to me to be a Latina that has white skin privilege, to be the face of what Latinas should look like in the United States. Because, you know, our image as Latinas is always like me, you know, it's the long black hair, it's the light skin, you know, it's medium size, you know, curves, you know, you're not too big or you're not too small. And I fit kind of that description almost perfectly, and that makes me the Latina to be. That's not how my mother looks, that's not how my grandmother looks, that's not how a lot of the women in my family, they come in all varieties and shades, and their experiences with racism in the United States is just shaped by that identity, by that feeling of like, we look a certain way, but we don't feel that way. And that's how I started approaching you know, feminism, or at least thinking about it as, who am I? Am I a white woman? Am I a woman of color? And I realized that my experiences do make me a woman of color, and what I look like sometimes can be confusing to people. So I have to evaluate it from both sides.
Thank you, Patricia. Tiloma, you want to chime in?
So I'm not on Twitter. I mean, I have an account, but
How dare you?
I'm not on it. It's too complicated. I'm sorry. I cannot be this concise in my life to say that. But I heard about it. So it crossed over into this Luddite world of non-Twittering. It crossed over, and actually, everything that a lot of the feminist women of color, I'm going to use that word, whether or not we all agree that that's a word that embraces us. There was so much amazing rhetoric and language coming out of it that really resonated with me, as you yourself have said. And it keeps coming up because even though that hashtag was created and it was an avenue and a platform that a lot of women of color that got to opine and chime in and talk about the things that have silenced us, then mainstream media like NPR went and spoke to a lot of the white feminists to talk about that hashtag. And then it was like, well, I mean, NPR did this, and I was like, I don't get it. And then they finally brought in Mickey Kendall and like the woman who created the hashtag. And then there was this good discussion, but like, oh my God, what does it take to talk about issues that affect women of color and the way that we own these spaces and talk about whether feminism resonates, whether we buy into that term, and what would be a term that would include us. Like, I've been in a lot of conversations about whether it's feminism or gender justice, because if the thing that holds you back is only your gender, then yeah, like feminism it seems to be the place to hold your work. But if it's not just your gender, but the color of your skin and the narrative of how you came to this country and your socioeconomic status, that maybe there needs to be this justice component to it too. But when I say that to a lot of second wavers, you know, they're like, but feminism was supposed to encompass that. Like, why did it go astray? And I think we could talk about it more, but there are a lot of answers to that question. There's a certain point you got to stop putting your head under the sand and talk about it. So that hashtag was really key. And one of the most resonant things that Mickey Kendall wrote about after that hashtag in one of her tweets and then expanded on in NPR was that women of color need to stop feeling like we don't need to be paid for our time, or our time is not valued, that it's a privilege when we're invited to speak, we're invited to participate, that so far often we're like, oh, this is good enough, I'm not going to value my true worth. I don't mean just in terms of being paid like economically, but also just like, you deserve to be at the table in a way. Not just, oh, what a privilege for me to be invited, of course I'm going to go. And that kind of discussion is something I'm very interested in seeing as we play out and as we have a discussion tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Tiloma. Olivia?
I also have to admit that I'm not very active with Twitterland and Facebook when it comes to these hashtags, but I did, I ended up hearing about it through the grapevine and like through the blog sphere. And one thing that Affirm does as a transnational women's organization is to kind of address, you know, what is mainstream feminism, what does that look like, and oftentimes it's defined by white women, just to put it simply. And one of the things that we try to do organizationally is to try to proactively combat and address the issues that are specific to us as transnational women. Transnational meaning across borders, coming from 2 or more languages, cultures, histories. What does that look like for us as a Filipino woman? What does feminism look like for me? So what Patricia was saying earlier, just like when it comes to, you know, issues around slut walk or like these things that kind of trend within the online sphere, and of course like have its validity in physical space. and just like organizationally, like you see women actually coming out to speak out on these issues. You know, those are kind of some issues that I can't really relate to directly as a transnational woman, because I don't have the same privilege of making the choice of when I choose to call myself a slut, or when I choose to be like, okay, just Olivia, just call me by my name. So I think that one of the things that we kind of do through Affirm is we engage in these conversations on a regular basis. We just had a conference called Censorship, and one of the purposes of that actually came out of our summer school of women's activism, where the women within that space felt like the history that we're so often given when it comes to feminism, first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave of feminism, wasn't reflective of their experiences. And the question that was posed was, well, how can we as women of color, transnational women, shift the center and the foundation of how we understand feminism and history? How can we shift that so that our experience of being marginalized within whatever communities that we come from are at the forefront of the conversation of what feminism should be and what it can be?
Thank you, Olivia. Lori?
Well, first of all, I can already tell that this panel is just exceedingly intelligent. I'm so grateful to be here and to have this conversation with you all. And so thank you to the organizers as well for putting this together.
Tracking down people on Twitter.
I would just echo what a lot of my fellow panelists have said about the hashtag really kind of blowing the lid off a lot of these issues that have been boiling in our community and in our blogosphere for so long. I was so grateful to see it start so many conversations like this. I think particularly to see it come from Twitter and cross over into the real life world has been just so enlightening and special, especially because the hashtag itself is such a perfect child of Twitter. It has that sarcasm about it, you know, it has a little bit of that snark and that edge. Solidarity is for white women, and it could be taken literally on its face. It could be interpreted to actually be making a point that maybe solidarity is really only for white women. I think in that way, unlike some Twitter conversations or some hashtags, it's really opened this conversation and made spaces for us to be talking about all of these issues. For me, I think it's really been a good opportunity for me to talk about my experience as a woman of color, sort of coming up the ranks on this, what many would call a mainstream feminist website like Feministing, which brings its own challenges. You know, I'm operating in this unique space where a lot of the people in what I would consider my community, the social justice community, look to us as a mainstream outlet, look to us as, you know, someone with resources and a platform, and obviously a lot of privilege in having those. But at the same time, you know, we are an extremely diverse group of voices. We're incredibly underfunded, as I'm sure much of the work that's being talked about in this room really is. You know, we have had a lot of the women of color who have made amazing contributions to our website, invisibilized in a lot of these conversations, or, you know, had their work be minimalized or had them passed over for media opportunities. And so what has that really meant for our conversation? You know, for me, the platform of Feministing was, for example, one place where I was really able to work out for myself a lot of my own ambivalence around something like Slut Walk, for example, and to have that be a platform for me to share my feelings of ambivalence and interest and caution with other people, you know, some women of color, sometimes white feminists who were interested in that conversation. At the same time, we have a lot of problematic commenters. We have had some really awful situations where, you know, a woman of color will write something about race on the site and it's just really poorly received. And so how do we build community in spaces that maybe were started by prominent white feminists and really bring them up to speed and make them our own and make them work for us, which I think mimics and parallels a lot of the conversations that are happening here. So I really see the hashtag as an opportunity and opening a lot of doors for us to have these conversations.
That's a really great point. And I think on that note, we're going to move on to the topic of race, which is a really important topic and pretty central, right, to this hashtag and this movement. So for all the panelists, whoever wants to go ahead and answer first is fine.
Maybe we'll do it backwards. Lori, we'll start with
If
you.
you want to start, Lori.
Gonna get tired of my voice. All right.
How have your experiences as women of color on the panel in the feminist movement been shaped by your racial identity? What have you done to reassert your identity?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question. I personally, I'm so interested and glad to see global and transnational feminism represented on this panel too, because I think that's an angle that's often lacking in these conversations. For me, I came to this work through specifically organizing around race. That was my first passion always. That was, I grew up in communities where that was a primary identifier and something, that I definitely identified with first and foremost as being what my identity was as Black, part of the Black community. In college, I was part of like all of the Black student associations and not at all any of the feminist, groups on campus. I was not like a WGS major or anything like that. And it was actually came from the experience of organizing within the Black community that issues of gender ended up coming to the fore over and over and over again, where I felt maybe disrespected, within spaces where that were co-ed, and I felt like because of my gender, I wasn't really being taken seriously in this way or listened to in this way, or, when I was interested in running for a certain office in a club or was interested in taking a certain leadership role, I was told I had to behave in a certain way and things like that. So I think that was sort of what opened my eyes a little bit to the ways in which I might have to address gender as well, or the ways in which intersectionality might actually be a part of my life. And then it was really through working in different international organizations where I started to understand how some of the global, how race really impacts us globally as movement builders. And you use this word in your bio, militant movement building. And I just thought that was so interesting because what I really kind of learned transitioning from college to the real world was that all of this work that I'm interested in and all of the work that I'm sure you all will talk about really revolves around money and how we get funded. And a lot of the ways in which we do end up getting funded or getting our issues noticed or pushed to the forefront have so much to do with racism, and it doesn't happen only in the ways that we know in our community. It happens, there's colorism, but it's internationals, right? So there's racism, and it happens, it really operates in a lot of the same ways and repeats itself in all different kinds of communities. And so that's kind of how I ended up interested in global work at Planned Parenthood, and also bringing that to a different kind of audience at Feministing.
Thank you. I think for me, I actually grew up in Montgomery, Alabama. And so we were like one of the only Filipino families in the area. So I think that my introduction to race was through that. We actually sponsored a lot of military personnel that were like coming from the Philippines to do training on bases in Montgomery, and also we sponsored like numerous like overseas contract workers that were coming to Alabama to work. And I think that through that lens, like through the personal, or yeah,
I'm sorry, maybe I've been lost.
It happens. Thank you so much for joining us. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that from the personal experience of just, growing up in that environment and seeing what happens when, you have families that are coming here to the United States for whatever reasons, a lot of times without any other choice, because if any of you don't know about the Philippines, the largest export in the Philippines is actually people, human beings, to work overseas as migrant workers. And a large part of the economy is actually based off of a remittance economy, which many like immigrant families probably are familiar with, just like that culture of, having a communal pot of finances and giving back to your family that's still in the Philippines. So I think that was kind of my introduction to race. And in terms of feminism, I think that it was embedded into into my experience because I joined with Gabriela Network, which was a U.S.-Philippine Solidarity women's organization, which is going to be turning 25 next year. So Affirm GABNet actually comes out of that history, that legacy of women that came from the Philippines here, many as political prisoners. So what Lori touched on earlier, just like the militant movement building, it comes from that uncompromising, disciplined spirit of these women who were political prisoners during the Marcos regime in the Philippines. Many of them were on the front lines of like farm worker movements and other movements within the Philippines, oftentimes risking their lives. So I think at the very core of our work and our and my understanding of feminism kind of comes from that lineage and legacy of, you know, political prisoners working alongside political prisoners, and then also just like growing up in the South.
Thank you. Tiloma? And I just want to make sure, I know there's a lot of people here. Can everyone hear us back there? Because I just want to make sure. Okay. Yes, thank you. Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So I'm just going to take a quick moment to introduce Nicole. Nicole Moore is the founder and editor-in-chief of The Hotness, part lifestyle mag, part personal blog. The Hotness is a celebration of women with extra cake for women of color. Through features on music, media, politics, and pop culture, The Hotness empowers, educates, provokes, and inspires youngish women to be their own beautiful. Nicole's writing largely centers on women of color and media representation, image politics, and empowerment. Nicole graduated from Williams College with honors in American Studies and History. So welcome, Nicole.
Thanks. Again, I apologize. I've been downstairs for about almost an hour now. Yeah, they know. They've been helping me with directions.
And I'm just going to repeat the question so you can think about it. So my question was, how have your experiences as women of color in the feminist movement been shaped by your racial identity, and what have you done to reassert your identity?
Thank you so much, Tiloma.
No problem. Do you want time to think, or do you want to just chime in?
Sure, I'll go for it. My experience as a woman of color, as a black woman in the feminist movement, has been completely and totally shaped by my race. I cannot be empowered as a woman unless I'm empowered as a black woman. So, and that's the duality that I face every day, the challenges of that. So I've empowered myself. I'm a writer, and I feel like social media has totally revolutionized my world and my work and my vision for my work, because I have so much more access to so many more women, to so many more women of color, to so many larger bodies of women nationally and internationally. And you know, it's the great thing about having a blog is you can create your own idea of what feminism is and who you are as a feminist. So I can be sexy, I can be really smart, I can be shoe obsessed and politically minded without having these titles of being uppity, which they call Michelle Obama, for example, or crazy, like they call Nina Simone. Even if I get that, the power of social media is I can delete your comment, which is very powerful. You know, a lot of people like to get on blogs and anonymously critique your work, but there's always the block button, which is such a powerful thing. It's a beautiful thing, right? So that's been my experience. That's how I have, I guess, created my work within the context of feminism.
Thank you. So it's a long
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so
A little
much.
moderating with you. So it's interesting, you know, I'm South Asian. Sorry?
There we go. There's a child here. He agrees with you.
I've got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, so I'm at peace with this. I actually enjoy it. We need more children, people bringing what they need to bring with them to
He's
be
feeling it.
present
He's
at these
feeling you right
places.
now.
Yes, sweetheart, I'm with you. But so I was raised in New York City. I'm South Asian, and I always got to be amongst different looking people because of that privilege. It is a privilege. It's a lovely bubble. And it's only when I went away to, let's say, I went to NYU undergrad also, which was also like I saw a lot more people from all different shades and different backgrounds. When I went to law school, it was much more rarefied, and all of a sudden I had people try to box me in, being like, are you Asian, South Asian? Will you join the South Asian Law Students Association? Like, and I saw segregation happening at my law school, which is all the African American kids would sit in one table, and all the white folk would sit at the other table, and us brown people would kind of shift from place to place. And so, and so I have always identified, and it has always been part of me, to be a person of color. But for my community, because we were the model minority, because a lot of us in the earlier immigration waves came in with a lot of privilege as like doctors, engineers, it's only after 9/11 that I think the South Asian community is recognizing what it's like to be a person of color in this country. All of a sudden you're going to get pulled over for driving while being of color. All of a sudden you're going to get the extra scrutiny, and people are freaking out. And I'm like, well, this is what other people that look like you have experienced for many years, but we've somehow managed to be isolationist. Like Nikki Haley is the governor of South Carolina. She filled out that she was white on her census. Her parents are Sikh who wear turbans, you know, and I'm like, how did you manage to tell yourself that you're not? Yeah. What is this fantasy that you're living in? You know, so I have to admit, while I think I'm feminist, and when I was in a corporate sphere, I would identify by that more because that was like the thing that you could charge forward with. But in the social justice movements I sit in, that's not what I find that resonates with my peers, and that's not what I find I rally behind. Like, I talk about gender justice, I talk about reproductive justice. Like, I think that justice issues, to me, are what I rally behind, although I am approaching it as a woman of color. You know, so now now I'm older than, you know, now I'm using the word feminist a lot more, but I'm using it to define in a way that I define, and a way that I feel like not many other people would define it as. I ground feminism in being also woman of color and needing a lot more than just to adjust my gender for me to live equally and fully and to the fullest potential that I have. So I was just part of this public arts project in Brooklyn with the Brooklyn Museum and Creative Time with this feminist activist artist called Suzanne Lacey. And it was brilliant and it was amazing. And it just, you know, it's about feminism, but I was able to be part of the advisory board, and I brought in much more. I felt I helped contribute to making sure that women of color, women who were part of smaller organizations grounded in a community, could be present and their voices could be heard. But it's really funny that the day of, there was a VIP room, and in that VIP room were a lot of white women. And then I walked in there, I'm like, oh, and I felt weird, you know, I felt weird. And then New York Times coverage, like, I love the Grey Lady, but like, it was all about arts, and it completely dropped that social activism, that feminist activism. And so I'm like, if media coverage is to an event, as the New York Times coverage was of this, and you can't rely on a lot of women's eNews. I apologize, I think you guys are different. But, but like, we're talking, but it just gets dropped out of the narrative, even when it's intentionally, thoughtfully tried to be put at the forefront, you know. So I felt like I was part of that project, even though I see it happening, because if I wasn't there and if I wasn't talking, then yes, I was not really a token, but if I wasn't there talking about these issues, who would bring it up? So there are times when I will step in as a woman of color, identifying as feminist, to bring these discussions to spaces that wouldn't otherwise have it. And then there are other times when I'm like, I just can't, and I step away. And I'm like, it just doesn't resonate with me. It's not my space, and I step away. And it's I deciding when to do that, because it takes it out of me to always be the one that's banging in these issues against surprisingly resisting ears, or ears that hear but don't really embed it. So I need time to kind of step away and be like, actually, this is not a space where I feel like I can participate, so you will all go on ahead.
Thank you, Tiloma, and as a South Asian sister, I felt a lot of the things that you were saying, so thank you so much. Patricia?
You know, the connecting thread here was everybody's like, my race came before my feminism, like my acknowledgement of my culture and who I am as a person, as a woman, was way before my gender. I mean, I was born female, I don't know, like I never not known that. So that was like the default. So the fact that being a woman was the only thing that connected all of us, that was like way beyond my life experiences. Like, you know, I mean, I was born actually in the Dominican Republic, and you know, my family moved to the United States when I was about 6, 7 years old. So my identity was formed by a household that was Spanish speaking and very Dominican. And then an outside world that was only English speaking, so I had to translate, like, you know, I'm in school and I'm writing and I'm reading books in English, and I'm learning authors that I had never heard of, and even though they're very common, like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was that? I don't know. Like, I go home and I'm like, I have no idea who that guy is. Never heard of him. You know, and I'm like, I need help with my homework, and she's like, let me see. I can't read that, honey. I'm sorry. I can't, you know, I mean, I was going to like welfare office with her to translate the application and doctor's appointment. And this is not just my mother, but my entire family. So my life was that. It was just helping the women that needed, even though I was much younger than them, only because I knew the language. And I could read better than a lot of them. A lot of women in my family, they were pulled out of school when they were young girls so they can help out in household chores. I have aunts that they can't write their own name. The only things that they know how to read are Bible verses, and I'm sure that they've memorized them. I mean, they see, you know, they look at it, they open the Bible and they're reading it, but I'm almost certain that they don't really understand it. It's more a memorization thing. So I would be at nighttime also like reading the Bible for them, and that's how I grew up. And then, you know, I graduated high school, and I go to Columbia University, you know, like, so I'm a girl from Brooklyn, a Dominican girl from Brooklyn, and I'm there. I was so out of place. I'm like, what is this place? Like, who are you? Why are so many white people here? I was so like out of my element. First, I grew up in East New York, you know, so literally everybody, like 90% of my community was black, and then 10%, you know, 9% was Puerto Rican, and then there was like my Dominican family. So even there weren't even that many people like me. So I always felt like it was just. And then I'm in this place, and suddenly, you know, everybody's like pulling me apart, like, you, oh, you want to join the Dominican Students Association and the Latino students? And I'm like, what? No. And then I was branded as like this uppity, you know, girl that she thinks she's better. Like, what is it? Is it because, you know, because you're white? Do you think you're white? Or you think you're better? You know, and also I was studying engineering, and a lot of the students that were organizing, they were either studying, you know, like political science or anything. They were in Columbia College. They were in liberal arts. I'm like, I have to be in a lab right now. I can't do this. I can't organize. So I became branded as the girl that did not want to be known as a Dominican or was ashamed of her culture. And I was like hanging out with like South Asian kids because it was engineering and everybody was Asian. I was I'm like, everybody was Chinese and Indian, and then there's me. Oh, there was another Dominican guy, but it was a guy, right? So the women, a few women that were there were Asian women. And I was the only Latino woman in my entire, like, the whole school, but definitely my entire department. So suddenly, where I'm just like, oh, I'm identifying more as a woman in science, and, you know, forget about me being a Dominican, I feel really alone. Like, nobody understands what Platanos are. Like, nobody understands, like, what it means that, like, I have to switch from, like, speaking Spanish to speaking English with my sister, and, you know, in Spanglish with the other aunt. You know, it's weird. And they don't understand it. They're just like, what is this? What are you doing? And I had to start, like, evaluating, again, like, my identity. Like, who am I? Am I more of am I just an engineer? Am I a Latina engineer? Like, what does this mean? What does it even mean to be a Dominican woman? And feminism wasn't even in the table. Like, feminism was just not part of the equation, literally equation, because I was in engineering. It wasn't even, like, I don't remember even mentioning it myself. So, you know, I graduated, I became an engineer, and that's when I think it really, really hit me that I am not like everybody else in my office. Not just because of my gender, but there's just no other women of color where I am. I mean, they're all older white men who are just, this is their industry, this is what they do, they know the system, they know how to work it well, and I'm the newcomer. And I just started feeling like I need to join something. I need to feel like I belong somewhere. Like I don't feel right here. I love what I do, but I don't feel right. And I was like, you know, let me start reading. Let me start doing this. And I started reading some Julia Alvarez and, you know, some other writers, some Alice Walker. And I was just like, oh, I like these women. These women make me feel good. I like this. Like, it was just like therapy almost for me. I'm like, I think I'm a feminist. Like, oh my God. I think I've always been a feminist. And I didn't even know that. She was like, what's a feminist? Like, what's a feminist? I'm like, and then, of course, I'm having this conversation, I'm reading this in English, and I'm having the conversation in Spanish, so I'm trying to translate. I'm like, you know, feminista. Like, and then I ended up saying, like, it's women's rights advocate, and she's like, okay, so you care about women? Why we all do? I mean, how could you not? You know, and it just hit me like, okay, so I'm gonna call myself a feminist in English, and then I'm gonna say that I'm a women's rights advocate in Spanish because I don't know how to translate. And when you say feminista, it doesn't really have the connotation that feminism in English has. Like, it doesn't translate. So that was I still had two identities. I'm like at home. I'm just like, oh, Patricia's like, you know, she cares about women, whatever that means. And then like in English, like I'm a feminist, and I started having this blog, and thank you for the block button. And blogging and being on Twitter and on Facebook is what I think really finally hammered in this like identity of like, okay, you know what? You're not going to be able to call yourself one thing all the time. It's just not going to happen. I think we move through spaces. When I'm in my office and I'm working on calculations and drawings and construction site, I'm not this like Latina feminista. That doesn't exist. It doesn't exist for my bosses, for my identity in engineering. And then, you know, I get home and I open my laptop, and then there's Twitter, and then there's my blog, and I write about my life and what I grew up and how I came to you know, identify as something or came to the realization. And then suddenly I'm this other person, and then both of them I try to mesh it. Sometimes I'm just like, let me talk about being a Latina woman in engineering, but it doesn't always work. I can't always, you know, go into a meeting and be like, everybody, I'm Latina, hi, I know, we're talking about the MTA, I know the new subway construction, but I just want you to know it's just not the way that we work. You know, and having a blog and just being able to talk and say whatever I want. This is my space. It's like my personal diary that everybody can read. It kind of it's my therapy. Like every night or whenever I have a chance to write or to talk, it's the way that I can feel comfortable with myself and kind of bring all of these identities that I hold together. And yes, there are trolls, and we call them trolls. You know, like they'll come to your blog and they'll read everything you say, and they'll comment anonymously and pretty much insulting you. I've had people say that I'm just guilty. That means that, oh, you know, or your experiences are yours and they're unique, so they don't really represent Latinas, or they don't represent women. You know, therefore everything you're saying doesn't work. And you know, and sometimes I'm okay. I allow people to disagree with me when I write something, and they're like, oh, you know, but they have to do it respectfully. And never anonymously, because I don't understand why I'm not anonymous. You don't even know my whole name. I'm Googleable. You know who I am, and I'm writing openly about my life, and then you come and you want to critique me under, you know, behind a computer. If this doesn't work, so I don't do anonymous. And if somebody insults me, and they call me, you know, a dirty immigrant, go back to your country, you know, you don't belong here. Or my favorite, and actually that one I have it in the moderated comments where you don't publish it, but you're there, and sometimes I read it to remind myself of why I do this. And this man is talking about, like, you know, he starts with like, listen, cupcake. Yeah. I don't know where this is going, like, cupcake. And you know, and he's telling me like, you know, what you don't understand is that engineering is a man's world. You don't belong there. And he's just like, let me tell you why women in engineering are going to be the destruction of the industry. It's like, you are distracting. You're walking in a site and men have to look at you. They're not paying attention to their work. Somehow that's my problem. Like, my body is doing work, and some guy over there with a jackhammer is like distracted, and somehow that becomes my problem, and I have to deal with it. And I'm just like, I'm not going to delete it because it's entertaining sometimes, because you have to know what you're fighting for. But I'm not publishing either. I know. He's anonymous, of course. I can't even go and be like, in your face, because there's no face. There's no face today. And it's cowardly, definitely.
Yeah, I think there was a lot that came out, but I think those are some great points for sure. And I think, you know, I feel like we have a lot of bloggers in the room that also probably resonate with what Patricia has to say. So Maureen, if you want to take on the next one.
Yeah. Olivia, I'm going to throw this next question to you. How has the mainstream feminist movement silenced women of color, and what are some ways in which that can be rectified?
So I actually thought that this was a really good question, mostly because I think like at the core of the organizing that we try to do with a firm is to kind of be able to proactively create the spaces and proactively be able to direct and define like what our issues are. So I think that in terms of being able to rectify what the mainstream feminist movement has silenced, our solution is to do that, to like be in control of what we define as issues that impact us, that are important to us as transnational women, and being able to shape that conversation to be what we would like it to be, as opposed to just being reactive and reactionary to things that we might see within mainstream media. Because I think oftentimes, even within mainstream media, the question that we all have to ask ourselves is, who are the people, who are the entities that are defining, this conversation as something that we should be talking about? So I think that as a transnational women's organization, that's something that we try to do through our summer school of women's activism. And I should note too that it's been interesting because we've had the summer school of activism for the past 3 years, and each summer we convene like a group of women who identify as women and as transnational women to go through workshops on Saturdays. And it's been interesting just like throughout the 3 years that we've been doing the summer school, because each time we conduct the summer school, the curriculum changes. And all of that is dependent, I think, on the women who are in the room that are bringing their experiences, where we're kind of engaging with each other about our shared experience, but then also how we're uniquely different. There's actually 2 members in the room right now, Christina Hoyas over there, and
if it wasn't for Hoyas, I wouldn't be learning about the amazing things you guys been doing.
So she's the one that like actually connected us to Maureen. And I think that it's through those conversations of like having dialogue. I mean, we're a pretty diverse group. We have Christina, we have Gabar who's in the room too. So it's like from different perspectives. Gabar is Eritrean, Filipina, American. Christina's Filipina. And then we have like just a wide range of like people that come from different status, like so documented, undocumented. People, and I think that at the core of our work is like being able to understand that we have these layered backgrounds. There's all these intersections between gender, race, class, and just how we experience the world, and also the privileges that we're given. Whether it's through education or whether it's through being born in the United States or like having some kind of capital that our family has built on throughout the years. We understand like that those are all integral and important to defining, what feminism means to us. So I think that that's kind of what's been cool about organizing with a firm and also the women within a firm, is that it's like a collective conversation that we're having with each other. And so we're not as much of a blog, Twitter-based activism as much as we are like being able to try to have those dialogues with each other internally within the organization, and then also with other organizations that are similar and like-minded.
Thank you, Olivia.
So Lori, I have a question for you. Mickey Kendall states, feminism as a global movement meant to unite all women has global responsibilities and, as illustrated by hundreds of tweets, has failed at one of its most basic. It has not been welcoming to all women or even their communities. What influence has race played in feminism's claim to unite all women?
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear Mickey Kendall, quoted and have her actual words here, because she started the hashtag, but there's so much more that she also had to say about this and influence this conversation. And I think that, that comment is spot on. I think we need to go beyond the welcoming framework, actually, because it's more about a centering. And I think, within social justice communities, there's a lot of tendency towards semantics and long internal processes and conversations and dialogues to make sure that we get it just right. But I have a very specific thing in mind when I talk about centering the experiences of, women of color in the movement, because it actually has tangible effects. So, if you have a blog, are you writing about issues that primarily affect only white people? Are you writing about issues where women of color care about this? Are women of color voices centered front and center at your site? Are they having an actual impact and say on the direction of the site and the editorial direction? So that's just if you're a blog. I think the conversation just becomes much more big, and I think the relationship between blogs and organizations right now is really interesting. They are in this weird dance where they both need each other and they both don't know what to do with each other. We have blogs basically acting as the communications arm for the feminist movement, which is problematic and unsustainable infrastructure. So we need to fix that and fund each other and support each other because writers are not necessarily movement leaders, and I don't know how that ended up happening. So we need to
Why do you say that?
Well, I think I didn't start writing and blogging to be necessarily looked to for answers about the direction of feminism. I did that as catharsis and therapy and joining a community and thinking through my own issues and responding personally to things other people were saying and wanting to be part of that. And now I have people, I think I've adjusted to kind of the responsibility of the platform that I'm now part of, but that wasn't something that necessarily had to happen, and I didn't necessarily have to make that leap. And I think writers are writers. They're not necessarily activists. I think there's so many organizing skills that could have made a lot of painful conversations and interactions, especially on Twitter, go away. I mean, sometimes I open up TweetDeck and I cringe to see like the latest, interaction of both people that I maybe care about or know that they might have good intentions, but that is just failing them. And so it's just, I have like a lot of head dust moments when I see public conversations about race happening. But, the question is, global responsibilities, have they failed? I think yes. I think there's a very clear documented history of feminism, not just failing to welcome, but actively excluding the voices of women of color. We need to remedy this. We need to fix this. This is not something that's unique to the feminist movement. It goes back to the beginning of organizing. You had Black Panther movements where, people like Angela Davis were explicitly told that, there was no time, the time was not now for them to, talk about women's issues, and that time they had to put their race first, and that was something that was actively told to them. And I think that there were a lot of women doing, women of color and Black women doing amazing work within that movement that went unrecognized, and maybe they wouldn't identify as necessarily a feminist, but that work was definitely geared towards gender justice. And so I think it really boils down to having a good hard look at the history and being honest with ourselves about the pain that has been caused, the actual real exclusionary activities that have happened, and coming together to remedy that.
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much for that really thoughtful answer. And I think moving more towards something that's a little more grounded in politics and policy, we do have a question for Tiloma. And that is, we want to discuss the Violence Against Women Act. What do you believe, why are the reasons that the legislation took so long to pass, and what do you think are some of its flaws and successes?
Three-part question.
Three-part question.
You can do it.
I know, thank you.
You go for it.
You're looking at why VAWA took so long to pass. Immigrant women of color. Like, God forbid you increase any protections or immigrant reform and pass it through VAWA when it can't pass through other mechanisms ongoing at Congress. But really, that was the holdup. And it's also because we were not at the table to advocate for our interests. And I think, other communities of color are much more stronger at getting in there. The Latina community, the African American community, and this time the LGBT community was in arms, and that strategy started 5 years ago. I talked to, we all talked to each other, right? So the ED of the Anti-Violence Project was telling me that this was a strategic plan. VAWA has to be reauthorized every 5 years. And so 5 years ago, they were like, we're going to get in on this and make sure that there are more protections to our community. And then the Native American community also showed up in force. I mean, people have arguments about who was at the table and who was excluded even amongst those communities, but we were just not there in one way, in one combined, unified way. And I run a domestic violence organization that works with survivors of violence from the South Asian community in New York City. And so for domestic violence organizations like mine, across the country working with marginalized communities, however they look, we didn't have a strong voice on the Hill advocating for us. We had mainstream groups, did excellent work, but literally they would say things like, we got to get this passed, we got to get enough co-sponsors, we're going to have to drop the issue of U visas, we're going to have to cut it down, or, you know, like, celebrate the passing, but, like, they just did not hold our issues close, and that's why, like, I'm very, like, we have 5 years. We have to start organizing and present a solid, unified front across specific communities, but advocating for common goals, because it's going to happen again. You know, there's rising levels of xenophobia, there's, you know, anti-immigrant bias across the community. There's always been anti-people of color bias, and if you're a woman of color from an immigrant community that's marginalized in other ways, then you're totally screwed. So unless, pardon my language, unless you can really develop a unified front. So we have to get on with that, and there are organizations that are going to start, I think, taking that role. But they were afraid that, you know, one of the crazy iterations of VAWA that came out of the House was, rather than give money towards having U visas, which is a visa for victims of crime, they wanted to allocate that money to a study that would investigate how many times that visa was used fraudulently by women trying to have some status in this country. And anyone who's worked doing direct services with survivors of violence knows that it is nearly impossible to get a U visa. You have to get certified by some sort of law enforcement or government official, and it takes a lot. If anyone would want to put themselves through that hell, if not for a legitimate reason, like, you've got to be crazy, but this is the way they're thinking about women that look like me. You know, so that's why it was delayed. The second part was, what are its flaws?
Flaws and successes.
Which you've covered a lot of.
Yeah.
If you can, so I mean, elaborate.
So when I worked at the UN, like, we worked with countries that had not had a law about violence against women on their books. And I worked with them, you know, bringing experts from countries that had passed it on to, like, show good ways to do it. So yes, I think it's really important that we validate that domestic violence and violence against women is a crime. It should not happen. I see that. That is the success of VAWA. It's not something that you just think is behind the bedroom doors and that we can't get involved in and that we can't talk about and let's blame the victim. This is a public issue. This is a health issue. This is a community issue. We need to start addressing it in holistic ways. This is where VAWA fails, because it is a law and order, I was going to say predominantly or major, it is completely a law and order response to violence.
Right.
Okay? So your options are orders of protection, referral, you know, calling 911, getting an order of protection, getting involved with the prosecutor, you know, getting a case, getting a divorce, you know, going down that route. But as people of color, like, these systems that we have to engage in have such embedded racism, you know. I have women that will not call 911, they will not seek help because they don't want their partner to get deported, or they didn't want him to be judged because he happens to be a Muslim man. Like, these are not systems, or, you know, just outright shot. You're right. So these are systems that don't work for us, but our hands are tied in trying to explore new community-based alternatives that might have more resonance, because it's seen as we're being soft on crimes. And, or I don't know, did you circulate to the group one of the articles that you sent to us?
We didn't get a chance because of RSVPs were plenty for this, but we definitely can, you know, share those articles a little.
That would be good, because one of the articles that was in Time, you had the legal director of a mainstream huge DV organization saying that, you know, opening the door to a non-law and order approach makes her scared because she doesn't think then that we're gonna have, you know, that we're gonna have appropriate responses. Even the law and order response is scary, you know, for a woman going through it. So in the DV movement, there isn't the space for us to talk about alternatives. And civil remedies were, according to the Supreme Court, not partly, you know, it's not in VAWA, nor can it be. So where do I have to go to if a woman comes to me and says, I want help, but I don't want to call the cops and I don't want to divorce the guy? Like, I'm finding creative alternatives to that. And there's an organization called Creative Alternatives, that's interventions rather, that's doing transformative justice work, you know, and it's a process. I think it's important for you to be able to call 911 if you're in danger. I think that there's a reason that it's good to have a law on the books that you can use, but it's not the only reason, and it should not be the only tool I have in my toolkit. And if VAWA cannot be comprehensive enough to address my issues, I'm going to have to start going outside it, which is what we do all the time. but do we get funded? This is the funding thing. There's huge amounts of money tied up with VAWAs. You get vested in using these responses. Like an average government grant is $300,000 over 2 years. That's the average OVW grant, the Office of Violence Against Women grant that you get. My organization's annual budget is $700K. So if I get an OVW grant, that's bank, right? Like that'll sustain us for a couple of years, but I have to buy into an approach that my community cannot work with. So that's its flaws. So we have 5 more years to start organizing about bringing in things that actually work for us, all of us.
Yeah, all of us. Right?
All of us, yeah.
And that's a great transition to my next question. All of us, let's go with that. To everyone, how have you politicized your personal struggle? Nicole, I'll start with you, if you don't mind.
I remember I saw you ask that question earlier in the email, and I really struggled with that because I feel like every day I wake up, walk out of my apartment, I'm politicizing my personal struggle. Like every day, it's true. No, it's very true. It's like just the idea that I am trying to thrive in a country where, Michelle Obama, the first lady, gets judged on her body parts, where, was the woman, Marissa Alexander, she tried to defend herself from domestic abuse, from her husband, did a warning shot in the ceiling. She's serving 20 years in jail in Florida. And nobody's talking about this. Even if you look at Miriam Carey, the woman that was shot and killed a couple of weeks ago in DC, we can argue about should she have been shot, should she not have been shot, but nobody's talking about postpartum depression because she's a black woman, and nobody can even identify the idea that a black woman can suffer from mental illness or a black woman can have postpartum depression, because those are only things that white suburban women are afflicted with. Black women are just crazy and nuts and need to be shot down. So if I'm waking up every day and I made it through the day, I have politicized my personal struggle to survive and empower myself.
Thank you so much. Lori? Next to that.
I got angry all of a sudden. Sorry.
We figured this question would have gotten that rise out of everyone, so keep it going. Lori, if you would mind going ahead with that.
Well, you can add me to the camp of getting out of bed and just being myself. I also feel like devoting kind of my career to this. I think the blogosphere and career opportunities have really changed since I graduated college. When I graduated, going into feminism as a career was it felt extremely scary to me, and felt to my family